Welcome to Mindful with Minaa, where we explore how mindfulness can enhance your relationships and well-being. I'm your host, Minaa B, a licensed social worker, mental health educator, and author. Through insightful discussions, I will guide you towards self-awareness and self-efficacy, empowering you to effectively manage your relationships, reduce burnout, and be more present with yourself. So let's jump into today's episode. What's up, Mindful community? Welcome back to another episode of Mindful with Minaa. This is Minaa B, and today we're going to dive into a topic that affects so many of us, which is managing anxiety during difficult times. It's now February, which means we made it through the month of January, and as many people have said on social media, January felt like the longest month ever, and we have so much ahead of us, so much that we don't know is going to happen, so much uncertainty, so much to think about. And right now, we're living in a world where people are struggling with financial instability, political tension, climate concerns. And then you have to add that other layer of personal challenges, professional challenges, layoffs, difficulty within the workplace, burnout. There is so much happening. So if you've been feeling overwhelmed lately, I want you to know that you're not alone, because anxiety is a natural response to uncertainty and fear. And so I want you to make sure that you're not gaslighting yourself into thinking that you shouldn't feel anxious or it's not okay to feel anxious. That is a common natural response when there's a lot of fear and you're worried about something and there's a lot happening that you really have no control over. However, when your anxiety becomes chronic or starts to interfere with daily life, it is important to address it. And that is what I want to talk to you about today, because there are different types of anxiety disorders. And there are cognitive distortions, which are those sneaky, irrational thought patterns that can contribute to our stress. And you may have heard me say this numerous times, but there are so many things in life that we cannot control. But I want you to focus on giving yourself the life you believe you deserve by focusing on the things that are within your window of control. So today we'll talk about what anxiety is, different types of anxiety disorders, and things that you can do to manage your anxiety effectively. But before I jump into those coping strategies, I do want to define anxiety. As I said earlier, anxiety is the body's natural response to stress, fear, or uncertainty. What happens is when we're starting to feel anxious, it triggers the body's fight, flight, or freeze response, preparing us to deal with potential threats. So while occasionally anxiety is normal and even beneficial in some situations, chronic anxiety can be disruptive and exhausting. Anxiety can often manifest as physical symptoms where you feel an increased heart rate, muscle tension, dizziness, nausea, shortness of breath, maybe chronic headaches, but you can also experience emotional symptoms such as constant worry, a feeling of dread, difficulty concentrating, irritability, even rage and anger. And it can also create behavioral symptoms where you start to avoid situations that are triggering. And you also find yourself maybe having difficulty going to sleep. Maybe you're oversleeping. You're constantly restless. So there are so many different ways anxiety can manifest in the body, but not all anxiety is the same. And while some people experience situational anxiety, like nervousness before a big event, there are others who struggle with anxiety disorders that persist regardless of circumstances. And I'm going to break down a few of the most common ones. So generalized anxiety disorder is a very common disorder because it affects about 6.8 million adults in the US. Yet only about 43% receive treatment. And this is a study from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. So I gathered that data from that website, and that is a large amount of people. And if you don't know what generalized anxiety disorder is, it's pretty much characterized by this excessive, uncontrollable worry about everyday things. So like work, health, finances, relationships, even if there is no immediate danger, even if there is no threat. There are times where people will say to me, I met someone for the first time, had a conversation, and I walked away replaying that conversation over and over and over in my head because I feel like an idiot. I feel stupid. When I said this particular sentence, I probably sounded dumb. I don't know why I brought up my job. Maybe I shouldn't have spoken about my job. Maybe I spoke too much about my children. Maybe I trauma dumped. Maybe when I got focused on sharing that difficult time in my life with that person, that was trauma dumping. And now there's this uncontrollable worry about a very random conversation with a complete stranger. And as a result of that chronic worry, you might also start to feel it in your body. So going back to those physical symptoms like muscle tension, sleep disturbances, this is very common for people who struggle with high functioning anxiety as well, where insomnia is a big piece because once the day goes by and it's time to go to bed, your brain is slowly unwinding. Your body is also unwinding, and now you have quiet time. And a lot of people are able to manage their anxiety by focusing on tasks. And so you're replaying that conversation in your head over and over and over again, but at least you have work to focus on. You have to go play with your children. You have to go cook dinner tonight. But then once all of that is done and it's time for you to go to sleep, and it's silent in the background, well, now your brain is just racing. Your mind is chronically racing. And sometimes that can feel uncontrollable, shutting those thoughts off. So that is how generalized anxiety disorder can be characterized. Remember that this podcast is not meant to diagnose. It is just informative. So please do not take this information as me diagnosing you. Always seek a mental health provider. And if you are a New York City resident, a New York State resident, you can always reach out to me personally for a consultation if you are interested in booking therapy sessions. Now, going back to what I was saying, the next type of anxiety that is very common is panic disorders, which involves recurrent unexpected panic attacks. So sometimes you can have episodes of intense fear that triggers severe physical symptoms like heart palpitations, chest pain, even dizziness. And many people who experience a panic attack often feel like they're having a heart attack, which can add to the distress because if you think you're having a heart attack, that's a very scary thing. And if you don't know the difference between the two and it's happening, that can also increase the state of anxiety that your body is in. And often, sometimes too, when people experience panic disorder, it can lead to avoidance behaviors because they want to avoid people, places, or situations where the attacks have happened before. So I also want you to pay attention to different types of panic attacks you may have had and also avoidance behaviors. But also, this is another very common type of anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. PTSD occurs after a traumatic event such as an accident, abuse, or military combat, which is very, very common ways to describe PTSD. But there are also little traumas that we can experience in life, such as bullying or being teased or dealing with body dysmorphia, and having different things happen to you on a micro level can also lead to trauma, which then leads to post-traumatic stress disorder. Another one that is very common is race-based stress disorder. And a lot of people don't talk about this a lot. So if you read my book, Owning Our Struggles, and if you haven't, you can still grab your copy anywhere books are sold. But I share this story in my book because I literally can still feel this moment in my body when it happened. I was around 10 years old and I was in a Home Depot, and I'm 5'10", for those of you who are not aware how tall I am. And I was probably 5'7" by the time I hit the fourth grade. So I was very, very tall from a young age. And I remember having this encounter when I was 10 years old with two police officers in Home Depot where they stopped me and they were like, "Ma'am, can we see identification?" And I just remember thinking, why in the world are they calling me ma'am? Clearly, I'm a child. And they started being somewhat aggressive in their tone. And I remember feeling very afraid. And I go into more details in the book, but my parents ended up coming into the situation and they found out that the police officers thought that I had stolen someone's wallet, and someone in the store blamed me for it. They wouldn't reveal who the person was. But till this day, That is something that sometimes I can still feel in my body. It's etched in my memory. It's not going anywhere because it is a situation that has happened. And at the time, I remember having a lot of nightmares, which is a symptom of PTSD. I remember having this emotional numbness because I felt so afraid as a child being approached by those police officers. And so even now, as an adult, when I see police officers coming toward me with a particular type of stance, I sometimes think back at 10-year-old Mina and think of what she needed to feel protected in that moment. And I try to give it to myself as an adult. But I'm sharing this story because PTSD is a very common form of anxiety. And with everything that's happening in the world, I think many people are experiencing PTSD and they don't know. And I think generationally, our parents, our grandparents, and even our great grandparents are experiencing different forms of PTSD that they had to manage that could now lead to intergenerational trauma because maybe they did not get the help that they needed. Maybe access to care, not maybe, we all know access to care has always looked different throughout time. I mean, therapy is something that was shamed when I was a child. Nobody talked about going to therapy. Growing up in my community as a Black woman, especially as a Panamanian woman, so someone who is very immersed in Caribbean/West Indian culture, but also the Latin culture, therapy was also something that was frowned upon, and it was something that was perceived as a white people thing. Only white people have issues. Only white people have mental health issues. Only white people need medication. Only white people need to see therapists. And I bring this up because when we think of PTSD, we should also be thinking about intergenerational trauma and the trauma that we're carrying in our bodies on top of having to be exposed to different forms of trauma every day. Every single generation has been exposed to trauma. The difference is that former generations did not have social media platforms to amplify the amount of traumas that were happening in the world, but in our current society, even though we're going through the things that we're going through, I think it's important to understand that no generation has been exempt from adversity on a micro or macro level. We all have been taught to carry it differently. And that can manifest as PTSD that travels within the family system. And it also travels within our communities, the way we handle issues and the way we seek justice and the way we just manage our mental health. And so there is just so much happening right now. And I want to utilize this episode as a way to inform and educate, but also give you some tools around how you can maybe assess if you're experiencing maybe panic disorder or PTSD or even generalized anxiety disorder. There are other types of anxiety disorders as well, but I'm focusing on those three for this episode. And with anxiety can come something called cognitive distortions, which are irrational thought patterns that reinforce negative emotions. Anxiety thrives on distortions, and I want to break down three common ones, but there are plenty of cognitive distortions. For the sake of this episode, I'm going to drill into these three types of cognitive distortions that I feel are very common. So the first one is catastrophic thinking. I literally had a client this past week who I had to do a lot of DBT and CBT work with. And catastrophic thinking is something that this client struggled with a lot, and it took away from them being in the present. And something that happens with catastrophic thinking is that we assume the worst case scenario will happen. So to give you an example, some people will say, if I lose my job, I'll never recover. I will end up not having a home. I won't be able to pay my bills. I'm going to end up on the street. And if I end up on the street, I'm not going to be able to support my family. And it's just like this endless spiraling. And one of the things I had to help my client understand is as we start to spiral, it takes away from us being present. Right now, in the moment, you're still employed and your mind is already in a place where you're at a homeless shelter seeking housing and seeking support and seeking resources, and none of that has happened yet. The worst case scenario has not even happened yet, but your mind is taking you to the worst case scenario. So I want you to challenge catastrophic thinking by asking yourself, what's the likely outcome when you're drilling into something that's making you feel anxious, a thought that is making you feel anxious. Often reality is far less dramatic than our anxious minds make it seem. And so I want you to figure out how you can stay grounded in the moment by being self-reflective. I also want you to also ask yourself, what is a best case scenario? Because as people, it is normal for us to focus on what could go wrong and focus on what is bad, focus on what is negative, instead of reframing our mindset to say, well, if that's the worst case scenario, what is also the best case scenario? The best case scenario is I may not lose my job, or the best case scenario is if I do lose my job, there are resources in place that I can utilize to get me to where I need to go, to help me sustain my income. There are resources that I can apply to, and there are things that I can do. What are those things? Maybe you have to list those things out. So this helps you become resilient. And when we are resilient, it helps us to recognize that when challenges happen, we have confidence in ourselves and we have a belief in ourselves that we can overcome those obstacles. And so resiliency and self-efficacy is very important when trying to manage anxiety because, again, anxiety is rooted in fear and worry. And when you're confident, you're able to say to yourself, this is a scary thing, but I also know I can overcome this. So all of these catastrophic thoughts that I have, what's the best case scenario too? Instead of focusing on the bad things, what are the other options available to me that are actually going to lead to a healthy outcome? Another cognitive distortion is black and white thinking, which is when people see things as all good or all bad with no middle ground. So failing to see the gray area of life and not being able to engage in nuanced thinking. This happens a lot on social media where a lot of people have a one-track mindset. And so sometimes an example of black and white thinking can look like if I don't perform perfectly at work, I'm a complete failure. If I don't launch this business and it doesn't turn out this way, I am a complete failure. My business is a complete failure. And you have to remind yourself that many things in life exist on a spectrum. You, as a person, you are not all good and you are also not all bad. You are a person who has done good things and who has also done bad things. And in the midst of doing either good or bad, there are nuances to consider as well. So what you have to understand is people make mistakes, and you can also be successful when making mistakes. You learn from things that when they happen, you learn from missteps, you learn from difficulties. You have to be able to look at a situation and ask yourself, am I looking at this from a lens of black and white thinking, or is there a gray area that I am missing out on? And that can help you combat anxiety. Another thing is overgeneralization, which is when we draw broad conclusions from a single negative experience. So some people may say, for example, I had a terrible first date, so that means I'm never gonna find love. That is actually not true. Or people will say, to use common events, right? We see all of these things happening on a political climate. So it leads to this feeling of, I'm never going to be safe. I'm never going to have a good job. I want you to think about the ways you use the word never. And I want you to look for counter examples, moments in your life where things did work out differently. And again, one of the ways that we learn to grow in life is to be resourceful. And to ask ourselves, when we're faced with adversity, where does my power lie? We do not want to walk through the world feeling disempowered because that increases anxiety. Again, if anxiety is this chronic state of fear and worry, and your mindset is, I'm a shitty person. Your mindset is, I'm not smart. I'm not good enough. I'm always going to be depressed. I'm always going to be anxious. Bad things are always going to happen to me. Those are disempowered thoughts, and that cuts you off from feeling resilient. That also cuts you off from self-efficacy. It's possible for two things to be true at once. We can say, man, life is hard right now, and I can overcome the things that are in my control. And I can also figure out ways to increase the health of my life, to increase the quality of my life. I have to focus on the things that are within my control. And I can also acknowledge the things that are outside of my control feel really heavy and it's really scary, but that doesn't define my life or the future I'm going to have. Okay, so I want you to figure out ways that you can overcome these different forms of cognitive distortions. And I'm going to walk you through some DBT techniques, which stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. And this is an evidence-based modality that really helps people process their emotions and counteract negative thoughts that increases anxiety. So one of my favorite mindfulness/grounding techniques is the 5 4 3 2 1 technique, which is where you name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things that you hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing that you taste. This brings your focus to the present. This is an exercise that I had did with a client this week where I had to help them understand, listen, you're spiraling and I want you to figure out how to be present right now because you're spiraling on worst case scenarios. And we have to understand that when we're thinking about worst case scenarios, we're manufacturing reality. And unless there are facts to show that this thing is actually happening, the thoughts in your mind are simply just thoughts. So learn how to be grounded so that you can combat the worst case scenario thinking without saying to yourself, oh my God, this is what's going to happen and this is what's going to happen. It's like we don't know what's going to happen yet. So you need to learn how to be present. So name 5 things you can see, 4 things you feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And if that feels too overwhelming, focus on 1 sense. Maybe just focus on 5 things you can see in a room. Touch something. Cook something so you can smell it, light a candle, do something to keep you grounded. Another exercise that I think is very important for managing anxiety is cognitive reframing. So when you have an anxious thought, there are times where you can ask yourself, is this thought based on facts or assumptions? Again, catastrophic thinking can be assumptions. Even black and white thinking is assumptions because we'll say this person must have done this thing because of this, and we really do not know. Sometimes personalization gets drawn into that, and personalization is basically when we take other people's actions personally. That is also a cognitive distortion. Fortune telling is when we start to say we can predict the future. So I really want you to pay attention to facts, what is real versus what is an assumption. I also want you to ask yourself, what evidence do I have for and against this belief? Do I have evidence to show that this belief that I have is real? And maybe there are times where you might say, yes, this thing has happened before. And so you have to ask yourself, what are some things that I can do to equip myself if something bad were to happen? If that negative belief or thought or just idea were to come to mind, can I overcome it? That's the question I want you to ask yourself. And if you need to overcome it, what resources do you need? What do you need to overcome adversity? So I want you to be paying attention to these exercises. And the last thing that I think is really important is healthy forms of escapism. Right now, with everything happening in the world and also considering your personal life, this can also lead to those feelings of overwhelm and anxiety because, again, we have to focus on the micro level things like cooking and cleaning and taking care of our kids and taking care of ourselves and our livelihood. But then you have that macro perspective, which we're recognizing all of the things happening in society and how it's impacting us directly or even indirectly. And that can be a lot to take in. And I'm a big fan of healthy escapism because I do believe that things like art and entertainment can serve as a mirror and help us reflect on the things that we're experiencing in our lives. But because art and entertainment are forms of storytelling, it allows us to be immersed in a completely different world. And it allows us to find a sense of relief and a respite from the difficulties that we're chronically facing. So healthy escapism is pretty much a healthy form of distracting yourself from adversity and things that might be causing anxiety. So for me, I love rewatching Insecure. On my I'm So Mature newsletter, I have a newsletter available around the psychology of our comfort shows and why we're so drawn to rewatching the same TV shows. And I'm going to actually link that in my description box so that you can click on it and gain some resources from that, because rewatching content right now is probably what you need to manage your anxiety. Listening to nostalgic music could be a tool to manage your anxiety. Coloring, art therapy, dance. There are different ways that you can utilize art and entertainment for your own benefit and to maintain your mental health. So I'm going to leave you with this. Anxiety is a normal part of life, but when it becomes overwhelming, you do have the power to manage it. By understanding cognitive distortions, practicing mindfulness, and using DBT techniques, you can build resilience in the face of uncertainty. And so if you're struggling, please seek support. If you are in New York State, you can reach out to me for a therapeutic consultation. I am taking on clients right now, but also you can find support through other directories. You can also utilize the other resources that I have to provide you with psychoeducation on different mental health related topics. You can order my book, Owning Our Struggles, which is available everywhere books are sold. You can also sign up to both of my newsletters, Mindful with Mina and I'm So Mature. And most importantly, thank you so much for tuning into this episode today. If this conversation resonated with you, please share it with a friend and don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. Be gentle with yourself and take it one moment at a time. Until next time.